The Roman and Persian empires had shared a common border in the Middle East since Pompey the Great had annexed Syria in the name of Rome in 65 BCE. Nearly 6 centuries passed between Rome's arrival in the East and the Persian Wars of the 6th century CE. Over the course of those centuries, the shared border shifted, and both empires experienced internal regime change. The Roman Republic collapsed within a couple of decades of Pompey's eastern acquisitions and gave way to the empire, while the Parthian regime was displaced by the House of Sassanid. While there were social, institutional, and military changes at all levels in both empires, the fundamental nature of the relationship between the two great empires remained largely unaltered. Each empire saw the other as its greatest potential threat. Each empire saw the other as representing an intrinsically different culture or civilization. Each empire defined itself in part by comparison with the other, and each empire almost consistently had more pressing problems to deal with than their great neighbor. While the situation on the frontier remained fairly stable, the balance of power consistently favored the Romans until the 4th century CE. While the Republican triumvirs Mark Crassus and Mark Antony experienced military disasters on a great scale when they dared to invade Parthian territory, Parthia never had the power to seriously threaten Rome's hold on the Mediterranean coast of Asia, even during the period of civil war preceding the Augustan settlement. A map showing the deployment of Rome's legions under Augustus shows that holding the Parthian frontier required considerably less military manpower than holding the Rhine or Danube. Our information on Parthian deployments is extremely limited, but we know that most of Parthia's wars were fought in the north and east against other threats. Rome's most militarily successful emperor, Trajan, successfully invaded Parthia and pushed the frontier into Mesopotamia in the 2nd century CE. Trajan's invasion created a frontier that was still recognizable in the 6th century and helped to destabilize and fatally weaken Parthia. In 224, the last Parthian king was overthrown and the Sasanian regime took power. Far from being just a dynastic change like the ones that had happened in the Roman world, this marked a fundamental shift in the organization of the Persian world. The House of Sassan hailed from the same area of Iran as the ancient Achaemenid Persians. Sasanian Persia consciously imitated the Persia of Cyrus and Xerxes, even if it never achieved anything quite like that level of dominance. Some of the chief weaknesses of the Parthian regime, such as a severe dilution of royal power, were partially corrected by the Sasanian monarchs. The Persia that emerged from this revolution was not quite as powerful as its Roman neighbor, but it had closed the gap considerably. Rome would not have to wait long to discover this new balance of power. Sasanian Persia's ambitious founder, Ardashir I, claimed the rights to all of the Achaemenid Persians' former holdings. In 232, he was raiding Mesopotamia and Syria, and it required the personal attention of Emperor Alexander Severus to repel the Persian invasion. In 235, Alexander Severus was assassinated by his own soldiers, thus revealing once again the fundamental flaw in Imperial Rome's government. Emperors were military dictators completely dependent on the support of their soldiers. Between 235 to 284 CE, the Roman world experienced constant civil wars, and these wars opened up the empire to barbarian invasions on nearly every frontier at some point during that half-century. During this so-called 3rd century crisis, the Sasanians were able to win a few victories which caught Rome's attention. Shapur I, Ardashir's successor, renewed Sasanian Persia's attacks on Rome's eastern provinces. In 243, the Roman Emperor Gordian III retook Nisibis and Carrhae and then attempted to drive on Ctesiphon, being driven off the next year in defeat. After making peace with Philip the Arab, Shapur bided his time until Rome was once again embroiled in internal turmoil and struck again. Shapur conquered Armenia in 253 and sacked the city of Antioch, one of the 5 largest cities in the empire. At some point between 258 to 260, Shapur defeated and captured Emperor Valerian at the Battle of Edessa, in defining victory for the new Sasanian regime, which is later commemorated on a cliffside at Nakash al-Rustam. Shapur's great victory left Rome wide open, but Persia's advance was halted by a short-lived splinter state based at Palmyra. Sharper had relinquished his hopes of controlling Antioch, Armenia, and even Nisibis. In 283, the Emperor Carus invaded Persia and captured Ctesiphon. He was poised to achieve greater things, but he died in December, and the Romans retreated to their established frontier in Mesopotamia. The Emperor Diocletian reunited the Roman world in 284, and this restored order to the Mesopotamian frontier. The new balance of power, however, was now between two equals rather than a stronger and a weaker power. It was at this time that both empires focused heavily on fortifying their respective sides of the border. There were periodic outbreaks of war after 284, but nothing epoch-making. The new balance of power had a couple of new features. First, the Sassanians were now strong enough to exert pressure on Armenia, which was a client state now caught in a vice between two interventionist empires. Second, each empire sponsored its own Arab client state in the northern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, as the Romans sponsored the Sassanid kingdom and the Persians sponsored the Lakhmids. Each of these Arab kingdoms could be used to fight proxy wars on behalf of its imperial sponsor without necessarily causing a direct conflict between the Roman and Persian empires. In 483, the time had come for the Persians to restore control of Nisibis to the Romans according to the terms of the Treaty of Jovian. However, the Persians refused to hand the city over, since it was vital to their western frontier defense. When the Persians did not receive their annual subsidy from the Romans, the king was outraged. However, the Roman Emperor Zeno informed him that the Romans were no longer bound to fulfill their end of the agreement, since the Persians had reneged on their end of the bargain. Zeno was in no position to go to war over Nisibis, since he was tied up with problems in Constantinople and the Balkans, and while the Ephialites' threat was sufficient to prevent his Persian counterpart from collecting his subsidy by force. Ancient and medieval wars are often poorly attested, and it is frequently the case that what little information we have is fanciful and not outright ridiculous. Fortunately, we have two excellent sources for the Anastasian War. One of our sources is one of the best known of the late Roman historians, Procopius of Caesarea. Procopius spent a considerable amount of his career serving as the personal secretary to the famous general Belisarius and accompanied him on some of his campaigns. While Procopius' most famous work is the Secret History, his scurrilous takedown of the Emperor Justinian and his inner circle, Procopius wrote other works at the behest of Justinian, the most important of which was the History of the Wars. The purpose of the first book of Procopius' Wars is to set up a context for the Iberian War, a conflict between Rome and Persia that lasted from 526 to 532. Belisarius' successful conclusion of that war enabled Justinian's wars of western conquest, but of course the details of this conflict need not detain us too long. Procopius wrote in Greek, and his account was written for the benefit of the educated elite of the empire as a kind of official account. Procopius' account of the Anastasian War is reasonably detailed despite its brevity and its role as a preface for his main subject. A number of Procopius' details and explanations conflict with those provided by our other main primary source, Pseudo-Joshua the Stilite. Pseudo-Joshua the Stilite is an anonymous early 6th century writer who deals exclusively with the Anastasian War. We don't know the real name of this author, but we know that he wrote in Syriac and referred to Roman Mesopotamia as home. Pseudo-Joshua's Chronicle is the best preserved historical text in Syriac, and it indicates that there was once a full and thriving vernacular literature current among Rome's eastern subjects. An ardent Christian, Pseudo-Joshua addressed his work to a local bishop. Unlike many of the citizens in the provinces bordering Persia, it seems that Pseudo-Joshua's Christianity was probably of the Orthodox variety. Pseudo-Joshua is a provincial and presumably had no access to major imperial officials the way that Procopius did. As a native of the region, Pseudo-Joshua goes into great detail when he describes the trials and tribulations that Roman citizens of Mesopotamia face due to Kavadh's invasion. Despite the suffering of his friends and neighbors, Pseudo-Joshua writes to his Syriac-speaking audience that they should not blame the Emperor Anastasius, who is a good and generous ruler. Due to his great focus on the Anastasian War, Pseudo-Joshua also provides a fuller account of the intricacies of Romano-Persian diplomacy. The two principal actors in this conflict were the Roman Emperor Anastasius I and the Persian king Kavadh I. Anastasius had come to the throne in 491 when Empress Ariadne, the widow of the previous emperor Zeno, had selected him as her husband. Unlike the majority of Rome's emperors before and after him, Anastasius was a bureaucrat and a politician, not a soldier. Intelligent, charismatic, and generally good-natured, Anastasius preferred diplomacy over war throughout his reign, which lasted for 27 years until his death in 518. An eccentric, Anastasius was banned from attending church services by the Patriarch himself prior to becoming emperor for sharing his own interpretation of Christianity with anyone who would gather around him and listen, even in church. After he became emperor, he became a Monophysite Christian, and his conversion to this minority faith position was the source of many of his problems at home. In fact, J.B. Barry suggested that had Anastasius not challenged Orthodox Christianity, he would be remembered as a second Nerva. Although his name got attached to this war between Rome and Persia, Anastasius' reign was relatively peaceful aside from this conflict. Anastasius was primarily remembered for his budgetary restraint and for leaving the Roman treasury full, thus making Justinian's ambitious Western wars of conquest possible. Firaz I and 30 of his sons old enough to bear arms perished in a battle against the Ephelites in 484. Young Kavadh, who served as a hostage in the care of the Ephelites at one point, was one of the few survivors. Firaz's brother Balash assumed the throne and wanted to have Kavadh executed as he posed a potential threat to his new power. The Sassanid nobles, who were a great deal more powerful in determining the monarchy's affairs than their Roman counterparts, decided that imprisonment would be a more fitting punishment, especially given the religious stigma associated with killing people of the royal line. Kavadh escaped from prison and fled to Ephelite territory. In 488, he claimed the Persian throne with the aid of an Ephelite force. Thus began the career of one of Persia's most fascinating rulers. Like his Roman counterpart, Anastasius, Kavadh was something of a religious eccentric. The Zoroastrian Magi class was a major power broker in the Persian world and could cause problems for Persian kings who strayed from normal belief and practice. Together with the nobles, the Magi could restrain kings from exercising their power to the fullest. Unlike Anastasius, whose religious deviancy seems to have stemmed from intellectual curiosity and a genuine feeling, Kavadh's interest in religion seems to have been that of a master politician looking to leverage support from outsiders against the religious establishment of his country. Kavadh embraced the sect of the Mazdakites, a radical reform movement within Zoroastrianism. Mazdak and his followers are often labeled as proto-communists and reportedly believed in both economic equality and wife-sharing. At any rate, Kavadh empowered this group to seek their aid against the nobility of his realm and the Magi. Predictably, the Persian establishment struck back and had Kavadh deposed in favor of his brother and imprisoned in 496. Kavadh's opponents were so outraged by his actions they had him cast into a distant prison called the Castle of Oblivion. Under Persian law, anyone placed in the Castle of Oblivion was not to be mentioned or discussed on pain of death. However, Kavadh managed to escape once again, this time with the aid of his wife. After his wife gained the trust of the guards, who let her come and go as she pleased, she and her husband simply exchanged clothes, and she stayed in his cell while the former king walked out of the prison dressed as a woman in 498. Once again, Kavadh was a fugitive, and once again he sought and received help from the Ephelites, who restored him to power. This restoration, as one might guess, came at a very high price. From the middle of the 5th century forward, the biggest threat to the integrity of the Persian realm was not Rome, but rather the Ephelites. While the Ephelites are often called the White Huns, it seems clear that this was a mistaken identification on the part of the ancient historians. Our sources tell us that the Ephelites set up their own empire and exercised diplomacy with the same degree of adeptness as Rome and Persia. The Ephelites intervened in Persian affairs and, when possible, saw Persia as a potential source of tribute. If the accounts of Procopius and Pseudo-Joshua are correct, then the Ephelites also enjoyed strong leadership and military effectiveness during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. We don't know the names of the leaders of the Ephelites, but they seem to have been amongst the best generals of their age, unless they were merely the beneficiaries of the poor generalship of Firaz. Firaz tried his best to subdue the Ephelites during his long reign, but failed repeatedly. According to Pseudo-Joshua, one of his expeditions resulted in his capture, and the Persian king was only released when the Emperor Zeno paid his ransom. Firaz launched a new invasion as soon as he got home and found himself captured once again. Boasting that he could pay 30 carts full of gold for his ransom, he found out to his chagrin that he could only fill 20 carts and had to put up his young son Kavadh as a surety. After instituting a special poll tax to raise the rest of his ransom and then redeeming his son, Perez invaded yet again. This time his army was wiped out and about 30 of his sons were killed in battle. It is worth noting the details of these last two military disasters, so that we can get a sense of how clever the Ephialites were and how inept Perez was as a leader of men. The first time that he found himself captured, according to Procopius, Perez only realized that he had led his army into a trap after the enemy had lured him into an enclosed mountain space and had him completely surrounded. He had followed enemy force into the trap for days. During his last campaign, Perez had apparently failed to learn anything about scouting ahead and trying to discern the enemy's intentions. The Ephialites stationed their army behind a well-concealed ditch and awaited the charge of Perez and his Persian cavalry. Perez led his army into a headlong assault, which ended up being a headlong tumble into a trench. The men behind him followed heedlessly, and only the rearmost ranks were able to get themselves under control in time to avoid the trap. According to Procopius, there was a Persian law to the effect that most offices were confined to a small number of people on the basis of birth. Based on what we know about some ancient monarchs and some present-day trust fund babies, you can only imagine that these hereditary offices were not conducive to consistent competence in either military or civic government. One possible consequence of this non-professional military is that there were few Persian strategists around to contradict Perez and deter him from foolhardy invasions of Ephialite territory. Perez's final charge also indicates that the Persians probably suffer from a problem all too typical of mounted aristocrats in battle: a fundamental lack of discipline. A similar problem plagued the French during the 100 Years' War, as their knights tended to charge when the moment felt right without waiting for their king or commander to issue orders. To alleviate their problems, the Persians created agreements with the Romans whereby the Romans would provide some gold to offset the cost of Persia's defensive line against the Ephialites, and to help Persia pay a subsidy to keep the Ephialites at bay. Our two main sources disagree quite a bit over the details of this arrangement, and whether this was something that Rome had committed to pay in writing, or merely something that Persian kings extracted by fear-mongering about the threat of an Ephialite overrun of their territory. At any rate, when the Treaty of Jovian expired in 483 and Persia did not relinquish control of Nisibis to Rome, the Emperor Zeno pulled Roman payments to Persia, a policy that Anastasius continued. Procopius assumes that the subsidy was part of the same agreement that included Nisibis, whereas Pseudo-Joshua's account implies that the subsidy was a bit more informal and was understood as a separate agreement by both imperial powers. When Kavadh I returned to power in 499 CE, he owed a great deal of money to the Ephilites. Given the tenuous nature of his hold on power, raising a special poll tax to pay his debt may have sparked yet another revolt. His only other options were either to fight the Ephilites or to get the Romans to pay on his behalf. Since he had needed Ephilite aid to restore himself, it is probable that he would have had trouble rallying the Persians to fight in an anti-Ephilite war on his behalf. Furthermore, the experiences of his late father Perez probably made Kavadh hesitant to challenge his benefactors. When Anastasius refused to pay for Kavadh's internal problems, Kavadh decided that if Rome would not pay through diplomats bringing gold, then he would simply invade Roman territory and raise the money that he needed in the form of booty. For Kavadh, then, it seems clear that fighting Rome looked like a lesser evil than waging war against the Ephilites. By 6th century CE, Rome's vaunted legions still existed, but they were little more than paper entities which rarely if ever fought as a coherent whole. The very backbone of the legion, the heavily armed infantryman, was no longer the primary defender of Rome on most fronts, but least of all on the eastern frontier with its flat terrain and mounted enemies. Procopius cautions his readers that when they mentally picture the Roman troops under Anastasius' generals in Belisarius a couple of decades later, they should not picture the legions of Caesar or Trajan. This warning was necessary since ancient historians, eager to establish their credibility, would make use of obscure and antiquated terminology to describe the places, people, and groups. One implication of this is that the ancient sources also tend to prefer giving classical descriptions of battle comparable to passages found in Thucydides or Tacitus, rather than providing an account that reflected contemporary conditions. To that end, Procopius provides a description of the soldiers of his time. The mainstay of the Roman army by this time is an armored mounted soldier equipped with a bow and various melee weapons. Procopius tells his readers that they should put Homeric descriptions of unarmored archers with underpowered short-range bows out of their minds, and instead imagine soldiers who can propel powerful barbs over substantial distances and have the armor to take hits. In addition, he cautions his readers that they should not adhere to the Homeric belief that archers were less valiant than direct combat troops, since the Roman soldiers who achieved such glorious victories under Belisarius' command employed bows and conducted themselves with valor worthy of an Achilles or Diomedes. One omission in Procopius' account is that the Roman army was at that time divided between field units and permanent garrison forces. The mobile, versatile dragoons that Procopius describes were typical of the field units, which moved from front to front and were professional, full-time soldiers. The empire also paid for troops called limitanii, local militia forces which were primarily composed of infantry which supplemented the field units in a time of war. Presumably, the limitanii played a key role in providing food and supplies to the army when it assembled for battle. The Romans also employed a great number of barbarian troops to serve as auxiliaries. In the Eastern Front, these troops were typically Arab. It appears that most of the Arab troops in the 5th century were mounted troops who were a great deal lighter than their Roman and Persian counterparts, and they seemed to specialize more in raiding than in fighting pitched battles. Arab forces also served under the Persians in about equal numbers so far as we know. Like their Achaemenid and Parthian predecessors, the mainstay of the Sasanian military was its cavalry force. The Sassanians had horse archers and lancers, and these men were frequently members of the aristocracy or their retainers. Nobles had men who owed them military service, and they would serve as commanders over the forces that they brought from home. The Persians were so well known for their competence as horse archers that the typical tactic of horse archers, namely to harass an enemy with arrow fire and then lure them into an ambush or counterattack, had long been known as the Parthian shot by the 6th century. Due to their access to the elephants of India, the Sassanians also employed elephant archers, although this particular unit type proved far too slow to be used with any effect against the Hephalites. Like the Persian hosts of centuries past, the infantry under the Sassanian banner were poorly equipped, hastily levied, and largely an afterthought, despite the Persians having seen the combat abilities of Roman infantrymen for so long. While the Persian army showed a great deal of continuity with earlier and later periods, there were changes occurring at the time of the Anastasian War, and it would be a mistake to think that Sassanians were any more immune to change than the Romans. The Sassanian army was undergoing significant changes during the Anastasian War, and particularly under the reigns of Kavadh and his son Khosrow more broadly. Peraz's disaster at the hands of the Ephalites had revealed some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the Persian system, which seems to have been largely stagnant since about the 420s. It appears that the Ephalites had adopted the Avar two-point suspension system, which made it easier to draw weapons. The Hun Avar bow, which had more penetrating power than the Persian composite bow, and stirrups, which gave horsemen greater control of their mounts, a crucial edge in fights between swirling groups of mounted archers. Eventually, the Sassanians adopted all of these new technologies. In 502, it is not quite clear if Kavadh's men had access to these devices or to what degree they had been adopted. However, it seems reasonable to suppose that at least some of the men on the Persian side were able to take advantage of these new weapons. One reform which unequivocally took place during the time of Khosrow was the professionalization of the infantry. Unlike their unprofessionalized successors, Persian infantry from 502 to 506 were nothing like a match for their Roman opponents. As I mentioned before, Persian society and political culture was fundamentally dominated by aristocrats. As is frequently the case when an aristocratic ethos governs a military force, discipline can be loose, as was the case with French knights in the 100 Years' War, whose impulsiveness and lack of discipline resulted in catastrophic defeats at the hands of the English. Sasanian noblemen were not predisposed to take orders and saw themselves as natural-born leaders. Although discipline does not seem to have decided the outcome of any particular battles during the Anastasian War, the fact that the Roman soldiers were more apt to observe tactical discipline than their Persian counterparts undoubtedly figured into the calculations of the opposing commanders. To put it succinctly, Roman commanders going into a battle had more tactical options because they could count on their men to execute their battle plans with a higher degree of competence than their Persian counterparts.